come to Brussels, the heart of European diplomacy, to meet NATO and EU leaders.
I think it's a very good opportunity to speak about security guarantees for Ukraine for today and for tomorrow, as you said, almost everything said. But it's really very important that to use these 2 days in Brussels to meet with all our partners.
Alongside him, the head of NATO, talking about a peace deal, but clear that Ukraine must be able to negotiate from a position of strength.
Very much high on the agenda is to make sure that the president, his team, Ukraine are in the best possible position one day, when they decide so, to start the peace talks.
So, a big part of the problem was Russia for many, many years, long before Putin said you could never have NATO involved with Ukraine. Now, they've said that that's been written in stone. And somewhere along the line, Biden said, no, they should be able to join NATO. Well, then Russia has somebody right on their doorstep, and I could understand their feeling about that. But there were a lot of mistakes made in that negotiation. And when I heard the way that Biden was negotiating, I said, you're going to end up in a war. And it turned out to be a very bad war. And it could escalate. That war could escalate to be much worse than it is right now.
Because they can never join NATO.
Well, my view is that it was always understood. In fact, I believe that they had a deal and then Biden broke it. They had a deal which would have been a satisfactory deal to Ukraine and everybody else, but that Biden said, no, you have to be able to join NATO.
I think that what he's referring there to that last part was the Minsk agreements that he said everybody had agreed to, that there wouldn't have. Minsk agreements never had any provision for NATO.
All right, let's jump into today's deep dive where we're going to try to untangle this whole situation in Ukraine.
Sounds good.
Focusing in on the debate around NATO membership and all the recent fighting that's been going on in the Kursk region.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack there.
Absolutely. We've got a really interesting mix of sources for this deep dive, some from, your typical news outlets and think tanks. But we've also got some takes from some political commentators with some pretty strong opinions.
Oh, sure.
So it's going to be interesting. It's definitely going to be a bit of a politically charged conversation.
Yeah.
But as always, our goal is to present everything in a really impartial way so you can make up your own mind about what's going on.
I think that's so important with these complex global situations. You really have to look at it from all sides.
For sure. For sure. Okay, so let's get right into it. Zelensky, of course, has been incredibly vocal about wanting Ukraine to join NATO.
Yes.
But he said that this membership should only apply to territories that are currently under Ukrainian control. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's a very strategic statement, and to understand why he's making it, we really need to consider the history of NATO expansion and just how long Russia has opposed Ukraine joining. A key turning point, I think, was the 2008 Bucharest summit, where NATO officially acknowledged that Ukraine had aspirations to join.
Right.
And that just really ramped up tensions with Russia because they see Ukraine in NATO as this direct threat to their security.
And that historical context really does illuminate the current situation because some of the sources we've looked at, like from the BBC and Reuters, they suggest that key NATO members, like the U.S. and Germany, they're being very cautious about granting Ukraine immediate membership. So it seems like they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, they are, because Ukraine wants those security guarantees that come with NATO membership, especially that protection outlined in Article 5, where an attack on one member is considered an attack on all. But admitting a country that's already embroiled in conflict raises a whole host of concerns for NATO members.
Right. Like it could lead to a direct confrontation with Russia.
Exactly. And the Council on Foreign Relations, for instance, they've published analyses suggesting that neutrality might be a more viable option for Ukraine, but that comes with its own set of complexities.
Definitely. So even though the 2023 Vilnius summit seemed like a positive development, with NATO streamlining the membership process for Ukraine, it seems like the Atlantic Council is predicting that full membership is unlikely until the conflict ends.
That's right. It's kind of a waiting game with a lot of uncertainty hanging over it.
It is. And you can't forget about potential wildcards like Donald Trump, who has expressed some sympathy towards Russia's stance on this whole NATO expansion issue.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, some political commentators are suggesting that based on his America First approach in his previous statements, he probably sees NATO membership for Ukraine as pretty unlikely.
Okay.
He even went as far as to say they can never join. We actually have a clip of that statement. Let's take a listen. Well, that was certainly a pretty clear statement.
Yeah, it really emphasizes how Trump coming back into the picture could totally change the dynamics between Ukraine and Russia and NATO.
Sure.
His stance could really influence Zelensky's negotiating position and just the whole future of the conflict.
Yeah, and one commentator even predicted that Trump would prioritize ending the war quickly, possibly, by taking NATO membership off the negotiating table entirely.
That's risky, though, because while it might bring a faster end to the fighting, it could sacrifice long-term stability and leave Ukraine very vulnerable.
That's a really good point. It seems like every single move in this situation has the potential to set off a chain reaction of unintended consequences.
It does. And speaking of potential triggers, let's shift gears and talk about the recent escalation of fighting in the Kursk region. Reports from Al Jazeera, Euronews, and the BBC, they're all showing a pretty tense situation.
This is especially significant because it's the first major Ukrainian offensive in the area after things have been relatively quiet there for a while.
Right, it was a lull in the fighting, and now it's flared up again.
Exactly, and we can't lose sight of the human cost of this renewed conflict.
Yeah.
We've seen accounts from people living in Kursk, like a photographer named Oleg Pogozic, who described spending the holidays with missile sirens going off and explosions happening.
Wow.
Just think about the psychological impact it has on the civilians who are caught in the middle of this.
It's a stark reminder of how this conflict is devastating people's lives.
For sure, and as with most wars, we're seeing conflicting narratives emerging. Ukrainian sources are claiming they've had successful strikes against Russian positions,
Right.
but Russian sources are saying they've repelled these attacks. So how do we even begin to make sense of these totally different stories?
It's tough. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces because information coming out of war zones is almost always incomplete or biased or even intentionally distorted.
Right.
So you really have to carefully scrutinize every source, consider its motivations, any potential biases, and then look for any patterns or contradictions to try and get a clearer picture of what's really happening.
It's incredibly difficult to sift through all the noise and find information you can actually rely on.
It is.
And then to make things even more confusing, we have military experts like Scott Ritter and Larry C. Johnson who are saying that this Kursk offensive is a desperate and potentially catastrophic gamble by Zelensky. They're arguing that it's a way to try and guarantee continued funding from Western allies, and they've even gone as far as to call it literal suicide.
It is important to remember, though, that Ritter and Johnson have a track record of expressing pro-Russian views.
Yeah.
So while we should definitely consider their analysis, we need to approach it with a critical eye and strive for a more balanced perspective.
That's a good point. Ritter in particular has been pretty outspoken about the potential consequences of this offensive. Let's listen to a clip where he talks about this. That's a pretty unsettling assessment.
Ritter's point underscores how easily the situation could escalate if Russia sees these attacks as crossing a red line. We could see a response that involves hypersonic missiles, which are extremely difficult, if not impossible, to intercept.
Right.
And that raises the terrifying possibility of this conflict spreading much wider with potentially devastating consequences.
That's a sobering thought. It really highlights how precarious the situation is.
Absolutely.
And then we have military analyst Andre, who is suggesting that Russia is intentionally engaging in a war of attrition with the goal of just completely wiping out the enemy before dictating the terms of any peace agreement.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that strategy?
It's a brutal approach and ethically questionable if Andre's assessment is correct. It suggests that Russia is willing to drag this conflict out and inflict as much damage as possible without really considering the human cost. And that raises some serious concerns about the long-term stability of the region and whether any lasting peace is even achievable.
Yeah, you've raised some really important points there. It seems like every single move in this situation has the potential to set off a chain reaction of unintended consequences.
It really does. And speaking of potential triggers, let's shift gears and talk about the recent escalation of fighting in the Kursk region. Reports from Al Jazeera, Euronews, and the BBC, they're all showing a pretty tense situation.
This is especially significant because it's the first major Ukrainian offensive in the area after things had been relatively quiet there for a while.
Right. It was a lull in the fighting, and now it's flared up again.
Exactly. And we can't lose sight of the human costs of this renewed conflict. We've seen accounts from people living in Kursk, like a photographer named Oleg Pogozic, who described spending the holidays with missile sirens going off and explosions happening.
Wow.
Just think about the psychological impact that has on the civilians who are caught in the middle of this.
It's a stark reminder of how this conflict is devastating people's lives.
For sure. And as with most wars, we're seeing conflicting narratives emerging. Ukrainian sources are claiming they've had successful strikes against Russian positions.
Right.
But Russian sources are saying they've repelled these attacks. So how do we even begin to make sense of these totally different stories?
It's tough. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces because information coming out of war zones is almost always incomplete or biased or even intentionally distorted.
Right.
So you really have to carefully scrutinize every source, consider its motivations, any potential biases, and then look for any patterns or contradictions to try to get a clearer picture of what's really happening.
It's incredibly difficult to sift through all the noise and find information you can actually rely on.
It is, yeah. It really does raise some ethical concerns, and it takes us back to what we were talking about earlier with Zelensky's suggestion that NATO membership only applies to territories that Ukraine currently controls.
Right. It almost sounded like he was trying to propose a way to end the fighting.
Yeah, it's a strategy that we've seen in other conflicts, trying to reach a negotiated settlement based on where the control lines are.
Do you think Russia would even consider something like that?
That's the big question, isn't it? And we already know how strongly Russia opposes Ukraine joining NATO. They see it as a huge threat.
And then you add in Trump's comments supporting Russia's view on that.
Exactly.
It just makes everything so much more complicated.
It really does. His recent statements about sympathizing with Russia just add another layer of complexity to an already complex situation.
Feels like we're getting closer and closer to a stalemate.
It's definitely a possibility, especially with the U.S. presidential election coming up in 2024.
Yeah, the outcome of that election could completely change the course of this conflict.
Absolutely. If Trump were to win, his foreign policy approach, particularly when it comes to NATO and Russia, could have a huge impact on what happens.
And the potential ripple effects on global power dynamics shouldn't be underestimated.
We're witnessing a real shift in the global order, and the Ukraine conflict is at the center of it all.
It's like watching a high-stakes game of chess unfold, where every move has these massive consequences.
A very high-stakes game indeed, and the players involved aren't always predictable.
So we've talked about Zelensky's position, NATO's concerns, and Trump's potential influence. But let's circle back to what's actually happening on the ground, specifically this Kursk offensive that's been making headlines.
Yes, the Kursk offensive raises some crucial questions. Is it a strategic move by Ukraine or a desperate gamble to try and influence global opinion and keep that support coming in?
Some military experts seem to think it's more of a desperate move. Scott Ritter even went as far as to call it literal suicide.
He did, and even though Ritter's known for his pro-Russian stance, his assessment is still something we need to consider. It's important to look at all perspectives.
It is interesting, though, how Ukrainian sources are painting a completely different picture. They're claiming to have successfully hit Russian positions.
And that's where the fog of war comes in. Information is often incomplete or biased, which makes it really hard to figure out what's actually happening on the ground.
So how do we make sense of these conflicting narratives?
It takes a lot of careful examination, looking at the sources, thinking about their motivations, and then trying to find any patterns or inconsistencies. It's like piecing together a puzzle with a bunch of missing pieces.
And amidst all this strategic analysis, it's crucial to remember the human cost of this conflict.
Absolutely. We can't get so caught up in analyzing the strategies that we forget real people are losing their lives every day.
It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitical game and lose sight of the human tragedy unfolding.
And that's why we need to keep asking the tough questions. What are the potential consequences of escalation? What are the ethical implications of the strategies being employed? And most importantly, how can we work towards a peaceful resolution?
Because at the end of the day, that's what matters most, isn't it? Finding a way to end the violence and the suffering.
It is, but achieving peace in such a complex situation is going to require diplomacy, compromise, and a willingness from all sides to see each other's perspectives.
Which can be incredibly difficult, especially when emotions are running high and there's so much mistrust.
It's true, but we can't give up hope. History has shown us that even the most bitter rivals can find common ground when the conditions are right and the incentives are strong enough.
So what would it take to create those right conditions and incentives in this case?
That's a tough question with no easy answers. It would probably require a combination of things: pressure from the international community, war fatigue on both sides, and maybe most importantly, a genuine desire for peace from those in power.
And that desire for peace, is it really there on both sides?
That's something we can only speculate about, but hopefully beneath all the rhetoric and the posturing, there's a flicker of recognition that continuing this conflict will only lead to more suffering and instability.
Because in the end, everyone loses in a war, don't they?
They do, and it's a truth that we must never forget no matter how complicated things get.
It's a sobering thought, but an important one to keep in mind as we try to navigate this turbulent time.
It is, and it reminds us that we all have a role to play in promoting peace and understanding, no matter how small our part may seem.
So as we continue to follow what's happening in Ukraine, let's remember to approach it with both critical thinking and compassion.
That's a wise approach because only by combining intellect and empathy can we truly understand the complexities of this conflict and work towards a better future.
And that future is not set in stone. It's something we can all help shape through our actions and our choices.
You're absolutely right. The path ahead may be uncertain, but it's not hopeless, and it's up to each of us to contribute to a more peaceful and just world.
Speaking of potential for resolution, we haven't even touched on the role of negotiations in all of this.
Oh, yeah. Negotiations are definitely a key piece of the puzzle. But the question is, under what conditions would both sides be willing to sit down at the negotiating table?
And what would they be willing to give up?
That's where things get even more complicated because both sides probably have things they absolutely won't budge on, those red lines they won't cross.
So it sounds like finding a compromise that works for everyone will be extremely difficult.
It will be. But history has shown us that even the biggest rivals can find common ground when the time is right and the motivation is strong enough.
So what would it take to make the time right and create that motivation in this case?
That's a complex question with no easy answers. It would probably require a combination of factors like pressure from international actors, war fatigue on both sides, and maybe most importantly, a real desire for peace from those in power.
And that desire for peace, is it really present on both sides?
It's hard to say for sure, but we can hope that beyond all the talk and the posturing, there's a realization that continuing this conflict will only lead to more suffering and instability.
Because in the end, everyone loses in a war, right?
They do, and that's something we can't forget no matter how complex the situation gets.
It's a sobering thought, but an important one as we try to understand this turbulent period in history.
Absolutely, and it's a reminder that we all have a role to play in promoting peace and understanding no matter how small our contributions might seem. Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that every action, every decision we make has an impact, especially in a situation as volatile as we're seeing in Kursk. Ukraine's decision to launch this offensive is definitely a risky one.
Right, we've even heard Scott Ritter suggest that these attacks could lead to a nuclear response from Russia.
Yeah, and that just shows how high the stakes are. But it's not just Ukraine making decisions here. Russia also has to decide, are they going to escalate things or try to find a different path?
And their decision will probably depend on a whole bunch of factors like internal politics, pressure from the international community, and their own strategic goals.
It's a really complex situation with no easy answers, but one thing's for sure, things are extremely delicate right now, and any wrong move could have disastrous consequences.
So where do we go from here? What can be done to de-escalate the situation and prevent more bloodshed?
That's the question we all need to be asking. And while there are no simple solutions, I think one important thing we can do is keep the conversation going, try to understand each other's perspectives, and push for diplomacy as the only way forward.
Because using violence just leads to more violence. It creates a cycle that's almost impossible to break.
It's a vicious cycle, and we have to find a way to break it. To do that, we need courage, compassion, and the ability to see beyond the immediate crisis and imagine a future where peace is possible.
It's a future worth fighting for, even when the challenges seem impossible to overcome.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive today, let's leave you with this thought. Given all the uncertainty we've talked about, the upcoming U.S. election and the volatile situation on the ground, how do you think things will play out in the Ukraine conflict over the next year? What are the potential turning points, the things that could make all the difference? It's a complex puzzle, and we've only just started to put the pieces together.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive for today. I want to thank you for joining us. As always, it's been a really thought-provoking conversation.
It has been. It's such a complicated situation with so many moving parts, but I think it's crucial that we keep having these conversations and trying to make sense of it all.
Absolutely. And a big thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. We really appreciate you joining us on this deep dive, and we hope you'll join us again for our next episode.